So now we want to switch over to the horizontal or cross sections. And one of the things I want to impress upon you is that the rules do not change. And so on this view, this is anterior and this is posterior. And so we start the same way that we did with the coronals, in that we are going to identify the lateral ventricle. And as we look at this, once we've identified lateral ventricles, we can see this white matter right here, which is going to be the corpus callosum. We are going to be able to identify just above that the cingulate gyrus. We are going to be able to identify the septum pellucidum. And then at the bottom of the septum pellucidum right here, this is going to be the fornix. Then we can identify gray matter that is impinging upon the lateral side of the lateral ventricle. And that will be the caudate nucleus. Then we identify this kind of triangular shaped area of gray matter, and that is the putamen. Then if you look carefully, you can see this little area of gray matter, this kind of gray line. That is going to be the colostrum. And then finally, lateral to that is the insula. Then from there, I want to identify this slit-like structure. And that slit-like structure is the third ventricle. The third ventricle is going to be surrounded by this large area of gray matter. And we've said that if we see gray matter on the lateral aspect of the third ventricle, that is going to be the thalamus. So with all of that in mind, we can identify this area of white matter in between the caudate and the putamen. And that is going to be the anterior limb of the internal capsule. And then we can see this area of white matter that is on the lateral side of the thalamus. And that is going to be the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So notice again that the rules have not changed. As I move posteriorly, I'm going to see this area and this area. These are also going to be lateral ventricles. One of the things that you remember is that the lateral ventricle kind of looks like this. Again, I know that's a very bad picture. Anterior, posterior. So if I'm cutting through on a horizontal line, it is possible to hit the lateral ventricles twice. But when I do that, I can now see the structures that we know are associated with the lateral ventricle. So once again, we can see the corpus callosum. We can see the cingulate gyrus. And if you look carefully, you can see a small little area of gray matter. And that is going to be gray matter that is impinging on the lateral side of the lateral ventricle. So that will be the caudate nucleus. Finally then, we have these little areas of white matter here and here. This is the fornix. You'll remember we said that the fornix starts as a midline structure coming out of the hypothalamus. But then as it wraps posteriorly and heads towards the temporal lobe, it is going to separate. And so we can see the two fornices as they've separated heading towards the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. So these are the structures that you will want to be able to identify on this horizontal section. Here is our image along with the list of structures that you'll want to be able to identify. And then here's just a continuation of that list. This is another horizontal section a little bit below the one that we just looked at. Again, anterior, posterior here. And as we look at this, we can go through the litany that we have been, talking about all through this laboratory. So we have lateral ventricles. If we can identify the lateral ventricle, we can identify the corpus callosum. We can identify the cingulate gyrus. We can identify the septum pellucidum. We can identify the fornix. And we can see this area of gray matter that is impinging upon the lateral side of the lateral ventricle, which is going to be our caudate. One of the reasons I wanted to show you this section, though, is that we can see the putamen here, and I'll just put a P on that, but notice that we can also see this area right here, and that area is going to be the globus pallidus. So the globus pallidus on this section becomes visible. Here is our third ventricle. And if that is the third ventricle, we know then that this has to be the thalamus. And so, once again, we can see an area of white matter here, anterior limb, internal capsule, lateral boundary of the thalamus, posterior limb, internal capsule. As I move posteriorly, I can see just a little bit of the lateral ventricles. So they're not nearly as visible as they were last time, and that's because we're on the bottom of the lateral ventricles. And as such, we don't see the corpus callosum in this particular section. But what we do see is, first of all, a nice white axon tract coming right through here. This axon tract is going to run from the back of the thalamus back to the occipital lobe. And this tract is called the optic radiations. Again, we'll talk about the optic radiations when we get to the special senses in Unit 4. The other structure that we can see is this area right here, which is going to be the hippocampus. So, we lost a few things, but we've also gained a few things. On the lateral side of the putamen, we can see again the colostrum, and then we can see the insula. So a lot of the same structures, but just a few new structures that really appear on this horizontal section. Same deal, we identify the image and then the list of structures that you'll want to be able to identify. And we continue the list. Our last horizontal section is below the previous two that we have looked at. And so as we look at this section, we can see anterior and posterior. But again, a lot of the same structures are going to appear that we have seen, all through this laboratory. We're going to have lateral ventricles. And so therefore, we can see a corpus callosum. We can see a cingulate gyrus. We can see the septum pellucidum. We can see a fornix. And we can see the caudate nucleus. As we look at this, we can see the putamen. Put a P on that. And in between those two, we see this white matter, which is going to be the anterior limb of the internal capsule. We can see our third ventricle. And since we can see the third ventricle, we are going to be looking for a thalamus. And as we look at the thalamus, we can see the posterior limb. Let's see where I'm going with this. Of the internal capsule. But what we can see in the area of the thalamus are these round-shaped structures here and here. And these are the colliculi. So the last thing that we need to figure out is, are we looking at an inferior colliculus or a superior colliculus? And this is very, very easy to determine, because if we see a cerebellum as we see in this image, we know that this is an inferior colliculus. If you see a colliculus, but you don't see a cerebellum, that is going to be the superior colliculus. So all you need to do is, practice a little bit, make sure that you can see the colliculi, and then just look for the presence or the absence of the cerebellum. This is a list of the new structures that we see on this image. I didn't relist all of the structures. Probably the easiest way to study this is to look at as many images as you possibly can, and there are tons of them on the web. I mean, just Google horizontal brain sections and you'll see tons of them. And the more that you practice, the better you will get at identifying these structures. So that's the laboratories for this trimester. We will talk about the laboratory practical and when we're going to have that laboratory practical in the next week or so.